you know? And I'm like, what? This is kind of Bible class. They got to study the Bible. I mean, I don't know. It's in the name of the class. Bible class. They got to study it. I'm sorry. Now, same day, got a visit from somebody from the conservative church. And she came in and she said, and she was one of my favorite parents. If you don't recognize the sarcasm, it was very much there. So she came and she was like, hey, you know, I am so disappointed in this lesson because you have these kids studying on their own, and what if they come to the wrong conclusion? You need to tell them what they should believe, because that's why they're at an Adventist school. You're supposed to tell them what Adventists believe. And I'm like, what is wrong with you people? Like, this whole thing, after that I taught there for 2 years, and I was like, I am out. I cannot deal with this anymore because you Adventists are crazy. This is what I thought to myself. Because this idea that there's one form of Adventism, there's one form of Christianity, there's one form of who God is a very, very foreign concept to how I was raised. And if we are going to have a next generation of Adventism, that means that we have to stop with the dichotomy. We have to stop saying that it's either or, because there's so many people who don't go in the us or the them camp, or the A or the B camp, but there's so many people along the middle, and so many people who feel differently than just the extreme part of either of those lines. And so if we want to have a next generation of Adventism, then that means that, actually, Edgar, I think that people are going to be more like Ellen White than less like her, because I think that the picture that we paint of who Ellen White and the pioneers is much like how we want them to have been. And they belong to our story because they're us. But I think that we need to start realizing that people who are Adventists aren't just us. They're not them, but they're all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. In just a minute, we're going to start the last of the presentations by the panelists, so I would encourage those who are picking up the cards with questions to start doing that at this point. Syd Shook, you're next.
Thank you. Nothing like going last. It's all already been said. These have been awesome. But since I wrote something down here, I'll go ahead and read it. I'm a little bit of an intruder on this panel because, as I like to say, I joined the Adventist Church as a consenting adult. Yeah, it still happens. A bit like Freddie, though. Because I did grow up in church, but not as the pastor's kid, but always as the best friend of the pastor's kid, and then I finally married a pastor's kid. So I don't know if there's a panel or like a self-help group for that, but it's got to be a special kind of psychology. I joined an Adventist church that was particularly populated with Adventists who had left the church disillusioned, later to come and find our church as a place where they could keep the faith in line with their conscience and experience and what the Holy Spirit revealed to them. And this church was Hollywood Seventh-day Adventist, still is. So if we're thinking about the future of the Adventist church and of our young people, I think hopefully I have a bit of relevant experience, even though I was not raised Adventist and don't have Adventist parents. I feel sometimes as though I'm a member of two churches at once, the Adventist church on its best days and in its best congregations, I think. I've found love and inclusion and inspiration and hope and peace. And on its worst days, I've seen isolation, exclusivism, and fear. And I think the question of our future is one that's brimming with possibility. I think we have a viable and vibrant and unique future ahead if we can engage with the world around us rather than flee from it. In fact, we need the world. And as someone who's been part of a variety of Christian traditions, I see that one of the great gifts of the Adventist Church is that we have a historical tradition of progressive revelation. A church, in theory, that believes God is still speaking in the same ways he did to our founders, who knows that the Spirit moves where it will and when it will, and that we are just lucky to grasp the hem of her skirt as she passes us by. As Ellen White wrote, "Let no one come to the conclusion that there is no more truth to be revealed. The diligent, prayerful seeker of truth will find precious rays of light yet to shine forth from God's word." And an admission, you may or may not have seen that posted as a Facebook meme in the last couple of months, but this is a young adults panel, so if you saw that, I saw it too. At Hollywood Adventist, I saw and experienced a church of young people who were eager to go in search of God's Spirit. And it reminded me of the story of Peter and Cornelius in the book of Acts in chapter 10, when Peter is called by God to enter the house of a Gentile and to eat unclean foods. And the Spirit shows him a new way of being more wonderful than the way before. And as Peter enters, no doubt tentatively, no doubt fearfully, into the home of Cornelius, a Roman centurion of all people, he says to the group gathered there, "You all realize that it is forbidden for a Jew to associate or visit with outsiders. However, God has shown me that I should never call a person impure or unclean." And chapter 10 says that while Peter was still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell on everyone who heard the word. And who was surprised by this activity? It was not Cornelius. It was the circumcised believers who had come with Peter. And if the Adventist Church has a viable future, I've seen that it's with our members, particularly our young ones who are ready to be surprised, who are ready to walk in forbidden territory when called by God's Spirit to do so. And what did that look like at Hollywood Adventist? To me, it looked like our members walking outside of our building and into the streets to listen to our neighborhood. It looked like building gardens to learn about food systems and help youth reconnect with our environment. It looked like going to mosques and temples to see how God is working there and to see what a future of peace looks like between us and them. It looked like standing with our brothers and sisters who are LGBTQ and affirming their place in God's family, even when we do so with fear and weakness and trembling. But it also looked like a place where every Sabbath we pulled our feeble selves together to sing, to hear God's word, to baptize, to wash feet, and to eat the Lord's Supper together. But I've seen another Adventist church too. And let's not spend too much time degrading ourselves, because the honest truth is we're not the only Christian church that is living a double life at this time. We're not the only church that has two faces. The second face of the Adventist church I've found is one that asks the question that too many of us are still asking, which is, how few will make it into the kingdom? God's will and heart for all humanity is that they will know him. And yet, instead of asking how wide, how deep, how broad is the net that God is casting, many of us in the Adventist church have often been too ready to ask, how few? Many of us are infected with a spiritually vapid pessimism that fails to have eyes for God's surprises and feet to walk to the forbidden places where we will find those surprises of God's Spirit. Let me tell you a little more about my own journey in the Adventist church and why each Saturday morning it's hard for me to get up and walk through the doors of my beloved Purple Church at the intersection of Hollywood Boulevard and the 101 freeway. I started attending Hollywood Adventist in 2009, and being from a non-denominational Christian background, my husband David and I had been visiting churches in the LA area, and nothing seemed to fit for us. And when I was about ready to give up, a friend told me to visit Hollywood, and I giggled a little nervously, saying, "Right, but I was hoping to go to a Christian church." But in my ignorance, I attended anyway, and I'll never forget my first Sabbath. A homeless man covered head to toe in tattoos named Gavin approached me during potluck. He asked me, "Are you a vegetarian?" "Yes," I answered. "Good," he said, and then he hurried away, only to return moments later with a gift of multicolored peace signs, which he slapped down next to what I found out much later was not just weird vegetarian cereal casserole, but a special K-loaf. And I sat across from a girl named Lisa, who wore an abacus around her neck, And I asked her, so were you raised Adventist? No, she told me. I just really felt like this church was a place where I could safely ask big questions about my life. Really? I thought, really? Where am I? Where am I that Lisa can ask her big questions and Gavin can run up and down the church aisles sparsely clothed during the sermon playing his harmonica and everyone loves it? I was totally hooked. I joined the church the next year, served on staff, and eventually became an elder. But today, to my great sadness, I am neither a staff member nor an elder. Too many years of campaigning for affordable housing, welcoming our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, performing Ash Wednesday services, scandalous, partnering with mosques for dialogues alongside our foot washing communion and Saturday Sabbath services had finally pushed our conference authorities too far. They were so glad that we had made space for special urban ministry, that we welcomed LGBTQ members who had been battered and abused by the church they love. But please, could we be more quiet about it? And finally, the conferences forced our pastor, who is here with us, Ryan Bell, to resign. The process was full of ambiguity, and when I witnessed Ryan being put through what seemed like the Inquisition and facing questions like, do you believe in evolution or creation? His answers like, I'm not really sure, but what's important to me and what I teach my congregation is in the beginning, God. And that was not enough. And I was, in the worst sense, in awe. What brought me and many other young and what I would call recovering Adventists to Hollywood Church was seeing people who were willing to go to forbidden places, who are willing to love and be loved by forbidden people, to learn from them even. I was drawn to a community in Hollywood not so much because of what they did inside their building, but because of their dedication to leave our purple walls and seek out the surprises of God's Spirit. And I was compelled to leave when I saw that that kind of dedication to God's call is grounds for punishment by the very church that we loved and served. And this is how the Adventist church, or perhaps any church in this time, can manage to both gain and lose people like me in one swoop, when they contend that responding to the needs of our members and our community and working outside our church walls in meaningful ways is a secondary calling to Christ. That is interesting ministry work, yet a danger zone, full of lines waiting to be crossed and people who threaten our Adventist identity. This can happen when we fail to see that this generation loves our church, but loves Jesus more, and is dedicated to the long and bumpy journey of serving him by serving our neighbors. Are we willing to consider that when we demand uniformity in doctrine and praxis, which was a fear of our founders, I think, that we are often asking a whole generation who are faced head-on with natural relationships that are so different from the kinds that our grandparents had and so varied, and we encounter so much, right? We live in a complex society. Are we willing to consider that we are often asking our young people to choose between following Christ and following the church? As I see it, the church has two options at this time: to ask how few will be included in God's kingdom and to watch the denomination shrink into the fewness it has imagined. Or to ask itself how wide the net is that God is casting. It can dare to walk in the forbidden places. It can grow from the outside in. As my classmate Ian Wong so eloquently stated a few weeks ago, instead of trying to draw all the edges to our center, the church grows outward to inhabit all spaces. I think that characterizes our generation well. But how do we do this? How do we avoid being insular and exclusive, which will undoubtedly lead to our own demise and our own diminishing and our own end? How can we get out of this rut? We must look to our uniqueness as Adventists to be a source of shared truth and life in our communities and our world rather than an ideology, which Paul F. Knitter writes manifests in a community when it proclaims something is true, not only because they believe that it really is so, but because whether they realize it or not, it maintains power over others. It gives us the power to limit God's kingdom, to make us in and you out. We are at a choice point, and I hope we will choose to, as Knitter writes, protect ourselves against the worm of ideology. He continues, self-examination won't work. Ideology is like bad breath. You need someone else to tell you that you have it. We honestly need others to say, hey friends, I'm sure Southern is a great school, but I'm a normal person and I've never heard of it, and what does this have to do with Jesus? I mean, honestly, that was the kind of thing that I was asking when I first joined the church. We need others to show us the ways that we have abused our LGBTQ friends and our children to the point of that we're losing many of them to suicide, right? We need other people to say, hello, sometimes you're more worried about getting yourself to church on Saturday than worried about helping my family get food or making sure minority children in our community have an honest shot at an education. God is working. God is working everywhere. He is casting his net wide, wide, wider. And we must be willing to go to the forbidden places, to be surprised by the work of the Spirit in the world. And we need, desperately, those outside our church walls to show us how. Our young people know this, and we're going to lose them if we can't imagine an Adventist church that is not focused on us versus them. Adventist versus Catholic, Remnant Church versus everyone else, straight versus gay, Saturday versus Sunday. But it is about learning to find where the Spirit has already arrived, to catch up with God's Spirit. I'm excited to share in a tradition actually that does elevate Sabbath. I think our world desperately needs it. We are a world enslaved to consumerism and the busyness of life, and it's important. We have important things in our tradition that I really think the world needs, that I personally need, but it doesn't need to be at the expense of everything else. We need Sabbath, we need rest, but the world does not need us waggling our fingers at it to make ourselves feel better, and it doesn't need folks with limited imagination who can only conjure up how small God's table is, how few will make it into his kingdom, how wrong they are, and how right I am. What the Adventist Church needs for a vibrant, Spirit-filled life of growth is to preach the gospel and to find it in every nook and cranny of our neighborhoods and every nook and cranny of the globe. It needs those people who are dedicated to going to the forbidden places, of welcoming forbidden people, of being forbidden themselves, and those who are ready, even in fear and doubt and worry, to be surprised by the Spirit of God and the revelations of God in places we least expect, and are willing to be obedient to those revelations, like the Apostle Peter. That is the vision of our young adult generation, and if we want them in our church, if we want a church at all, then we must be willing to make space for them and for their obedience to the revelations that God has given them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I thanked Ryan for helping to recruit this group. Something happened as we were in the final stages of planning this that I want to talk about with you for a minute or two. You wrote a piece for Huffington Post and said that you had decided to try out atheism for a year. What kind of a reaction did you get from atheists to that?
Before I say something about that, I just want to thank these 5 beautiful people here and how incredibly honored I am to be friends with them and to know them, and how proud I am of what they have said. I could not have improved on any of this, so it's just, and the way that this panel came together is a whole other story. But anyway, thank you so much for your courage and just for your honesty, and I hope that you can see how much the millennial generation has to offer if we're willing to listen, and so deeply honored to be a part of this. At the end of last year, was at a pretty low point in my life with respect to basically every narrative by which I had decided to order my life. And none of it was actually panning out. So I basically just decided to take a break. I don't know if you've ever been in a bad relationship and you just needed a break. And I found myself in that bad relationship. And part of it was a bad relationship with the church. Part of that was just a bad relationship with the stories that I had organized my life around. Stories are like foundations. They're like the structure that we hang our lives on. And when they're not working out, then everything starts to feel a little crazy and upside down. And so I decided just to take a break. I was having actually Thai food one day between Christmas and New Year's with a friend of mine who is also a student at Fuller. And it was the one day in Southern California that it rained like cats and dogs in the last, 18 months. And I remember being quite wet and protecting this book that I had just bought at the wonderful Vrooman's bookstore across the street. And I sat down and went to the bathroom to try to dry myself off and left my book at the table. And my friend Randall picked up the book and started thumbing through. When I got back, he said, what's going on with this? And it was the little recent book by a philosopher named Ronald Dworkin called Religion Without God, which sounded exactly like what I wanted. That there's all this talk about people who are spiritual but not religious. It's on the cover of at least one Newsweek magazine a year. And I had always puzzled about that and been frustrated by people who wanted to be spiritual but not religious. Because I always felt religious but not spiritual. And that's probably not as bad as it sounds, but I found myself not a very expert metaphysician. Like I was just not very good at the metaphysics part of Christianity. The part where you pray and there's a person upstairs who listens to you and sorts through it all and then answers and does stuff, and I just couldn't sort out any pattern to it. You pray for things and they wouldn't happen, or you wouldn't pray for things and they would work out, or you hope for things and think that you should have prayed, but you forgot to pray, but then the thing you wanted to happen actually happened and you didn't even pray about it. You're like, wow, maybe my intention was the prayer. I don't know. And you realize you don't really know anything about it. It's also puzzling and confusing. So I had, he asked me about the book, and I said, I think I'm just going to just take a year and live without God. And I said it just like that, like it was a whim. And he said, you should do that. You should do that, and you should write about it. And I had been writing about things, as long as I can remember. And so I did, and I thought maybe myself and 5 of my closest friends might be interested in this conversation about what it would be like to sort of follow my questions to the next step. And it turned out there were a lot more people that were interested in that conversation than I thought, and that I had planned on. And so it's turned into a bit of a circus. But I met with a really positive and warm reception from people all over the place, and also some pretty harsh criticism. So, the atheist community has been really welcoming. There's the overwhelming sort of generalized response from the atheist community has been, we're really excited that you're doing this. We don't really care whether you end up atheist or theist at the end of the year. We just think you'll be a better person for having done it. There are some people who I'm not atheist enough for them. They're the dichotomists, that Courtney was talking about. I'm just faking. In fact, some of them are sure that I'm going to write a best-selling Christian book at the end of the year about how stupid they all are and how Christianity is, the bomb. So I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. Others are, Christians say I never was a Christian in the first place. That's interesting. I find the antidote to all of this, though, for me has been to try to be attentive to people's responses, to try to be attentive to how people have responded to my choices. And I think it's relevant to this panel in the sense that I worked very hard at trying to find a space within Christianity, even within Adventism, for people to experience what I felt was the best impulses of religion and the best impulses of Christianity. And ultimately that, for a lot of different reasons we don't need to get into, didn't really work out for me. And so when Monty asked me to organize this panel, will the next generation be Adventist, and then I made this decision that I had made. I thought, well, maybe this is like Exhibit A, I don't know, where I'll end up. But I find that these forms are very brittle. The forms, the structures that we create are very brittle. They're very, they're difficult for folks that you've heard from today and their peers and their colleagues to find themselves fitting nicely within. And those forms are going to have to change. That's what I heard today. Those forms are going to have to become a lot more flexible, and I'm frankly not sure that we're up to it. I just don't know. If I had to guess, I'd say a lot more is going to change than what we think and what we expect. So we are sort of running towards the end of the time that we had set aside, and I don't want to take up more time with this. So Monty had to step aside for a second. I'm going to ask Jim to come up and...
Yeah, I'm sort of his sidekick, so I'll ask you this question, and that is, if you had it to do over again, would you have written that for the Huffington Post now that you have been into this for like a month and a half?
It's interesting. I have always lived my faith journey in public. The other word for that is pastor. Or evangelist, right? So I've thought, like, people have really criticized me. They've said, this is a media stunt, or you're just trying to create attention for yourself. And I thought, wow, if I was an Adventist evangelist and I was getting all this media attention, I would be the golden boy, right? It's not that the media attention is what's bothering people, it's that it's the wrong kind of media attention. And I certainly didn't expect to get a phone call from any of these people. I don't know, I think I would, because I find that by and large, people are benefiting from the dialogue that's happening. I wish I had a count on how many emails. If I had to give a conservative estimate, I would say close now to 1,000 emails that I've received. I've received far more emails than that, but 1,000 that are, maybe 700 to 1,000 emails of people who roughly say, I've been through, am going through, am about to go through exactly the kind of thing that you're describing. Thank you so much for doing this. It's the kind of email that you would get as a pastor from someone who heard a sermon and said, wow, that really touched me. Thank you for saying those things. So, in that sense, I've been trying not to be a pastor. I've been really trying not to be a pastor. And I sort of find myself in that kind of role again. I don't know what that means or if it's a good thing.
I'm thinking Monty is going to be back, and we are getting close to the time that we were going to be stopping. I'm not sure exactly what Monty wants to do because there is quite a bit more to this afternoon. Because Monty isn't back here yet, let me just ask you one other question, and that is, some of us have wondered whether your wanting to try atheism for a year might be a little extreme, that there are moderating positions between a fundamentalist view of God and a confessing atheist for a year. How would you deal with that?
Mm-hmm.
Can I say something, actually?
Go for it.
I'm your good friend and was a member of your church, and I think Ryan worked really hard to live in the middle of that for a really long time. But you can respond now.
Yeah, no, thanks, Syd. I appreciate that. Maybe it sounds more genuine coming from you. I haven't had a fundamentalist view of God for maybe 20 years. Some people have said, well, you don't have to become an atheist just to give up on, a cruel, vindictive God. I'm like, trust me, I gave up on that God a long, long time ago. You kind of come to face with a type of God that you wouldn't want to go to heaven, if that was who that person was. So, yeah, Syd's right. I think I worked really hard to embody a far more progressive view of God, which is partly why I ran out of gas in the position that I was in. That view of God is not well tolerated within our ranks, and at least in some places. So part of me, I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but part of me is, I think I gave up even on the idea of, like an ontological idea about God probably 2 or 3 years ago, or I guess I would have said, I really don't think, in fact I said to Freddie in the car earlier, I'm not sure it matters whether there's a God or not. Like, I don't think that that's really the most important thing, whether there's a guy or a gal who is like maybe not flesh, but could be if you want it to be or whatever, that's like this person, or even an entity outside of being, being outside of being, if we can even conceive of what that would be. I'm not sure that's really the most important thing. There's a lot of people consuming a lot of energy and a lot of ink talking about whether there's precisely a God or not, and I'm not sure that's really the point. And so maybe I'm really, what I'm trying to do is explore what would the universe, my part of the universe, look like, or what would it look like from the vantage point where we say that that type of theistic ontology is not necessarily essential. Because I started by saying, what difference does God make? That was my opening question in my first blog post. And that's what I'm still wrestling with, like, what difference does God make? And if God makes no difference, then...
Sure. And it seems to me that you aren't a 20-something, but you are reflecting what I'm hearing from the 20-somethings, and that is this dichotomous thinking, and from belief to unbelief, that just pushes that sort of questioning of the dichotomous approach that we religionists tend to have toward life.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably just immature, but
I'm not sure that that's the case.
Yeah.
But I think that because Monty is out of the room, David, just a second. I think that because of that, and because of the lack of time, that we ought to go to Dean Pauline and him making a response, because that may be all that we have time for.
Yeah.
And if Monty thinks that we can still get in some questions, perhaps the questions can reflect on what has been said and what Dean Pauline will say, because I think that we are just running out of time. Dr. Pauline, are you prepared to make some comments?
Jim, I think this will help Dr. Pauline's response. What is Ryan doing now as an atheist that he wasn't doing when he was a theist? I mean, are you now a member of the NRA or not? Are you
surprisingly little has changed. I'll just leave it at that.
more? All right, but that's important. Are you a vegan now, or do you eat half?
We can tell. Let's talk after. I'd rather give it.
That's right.
You need to respond to what you're doing.
No, I think nothing much has changed for me in terms of like my day-to-day practice.
Okay. Dr. Pauline is the dean of the School of Theology. He, for years, was a New Testament professor and scholar at the seminary at Andrews University, and we are very happy that he can pull together some ideas in light of the challenge that he's heard. Dr. Pauline.
Well, first of all, let me thank all of you for coming. For opening your hearts. I'm sure it wasn't easy, at least for all of you but Courtney. I mean, she could preach anywhere. But I'm sure it wasn't easy, and I really appreciate the openness, the honesty with which you have spoken. And I think that often we have not listened to the younger generation, not have heard some of the struggles, heard some of the challenges. And I think that was of benefit to us. I would note from the general age of the audience that perhaps parents and grandparents are more interested in this issue than the young. But here we are, and we appreciate you sharing. And Ryan Bell, you were one of my favorite students at the seminary. Absolutely, absolutely. It was so much fun having you. Courtney, you were cool too. That's 2 for 2 here on this panel. The others I haven't met. But I have to tell you, Ryan, when I heard about your experiment, I asked myself, what were you drinking? And then I saw your interview on CNN. And I thought, that's the Ryan I remember. That's the Ryan I've known and loved. And so what I just want to say is, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, you're always going to be one of my favorites. All right, so God be with you in this journey, and if at any point, you know, an old prof can be of some help, I want to be there. There's one little tweak I'd like to make on the comments of the various panelists, and that is I've written about 25 books, but not one of those books comes anywhere close to a book called Steps to Christ. I'm just wondering, Edgar, do you think maybe I ought to get hit in the head with a rock? Will that help me with my writing skills or something like that? You know, because whether or not, whatever effect that had on Ellen White, there's something there that absolutely amazes me still. That's just one little tweak. Otherwise, I really appreciated everything that was shared. I feel a little bit like getting up to preach at 1:15, you know, so I'm going to try to be as brief as I can. But I want to share a couple of global things. If you want more, my work is out there. I've written books on this website and all the rest of that. But just first of all, the history of Christian ideas, I think, is huge for what was going on here. You started out with pre-modernism, back in the Middle Ages, where if you wanted to know truth, you had to go to experts. You had to go to a priest. You had to go to a bishop. In other words, the average person just couldn't handle the truth, just couldn't figure it out. So if you want to know truth, you go to the experts. You go to the church. Then came the Reformation, and what I call Christian modernism. And the shift focused from the church to the Bible. If you want to know the truth, you go to the Bible. And that's the context in which Seventh-day Adventist Church came into existence. And I think you recognize that very much. A resistance against taking the church seriously. The Bible is what counts. But then along came secular modernism, which was grounded not on the Bible, but on science and empirical study and research. And suddenly there was a huge shift in the way people looked for truth. If you want to find truth, use your five senses, use scientific method. But that too has moved on its way to a large degree, and we've come to an era I call secular postmodernism, or post-postmodernism, you know, it's always in flux. But in this context, the search for truth questions the value of church, Bible, and science. It says if you really want to know truth, you will find it in stories and in community. And the challenge is that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is stuck between two worlds. And I think you saw some of that today. There was really no pattern here. You know, why did some of you leave the church? Why are some of you struggling so much? There's no real pattern here. It's not like one can diagnose as a scholar and a pastor and say, well, you know, if the church did this, you know, all of you would feel differently. I don't think so. I don't think there's a specific pattern, but we are caught between the ages. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I think, has a choice, it seems. One option, and it's a very popular option, is to go back to the 19th century. To go back to Christian modernism, simply affirm what made sense then, and stay there. There's another group that's done that successfully, called the Amish. But to what degree is there a mission there, a caring about the wider world? You see the issue? You can close in on yourself and be whatever you think is right, but unless you engage the world, you increasingly lose the new generation. The challenge is, what can Adventism say to a world that isn't impressed with church, Bible, or even science? And the brief suggestion I would make there is that, in case we missed it, the Bible is not a collection of fundamental beliefs. The Bible is a story about a community. And if we would see the Bible through the eyes of this new generation, it's just possible we might see the Bible more clearly than ever before, because the Bible itself was written. In a sense, society and culture have come full circle and are back a little bit closer to the biblical way of thinking. That may sound shocking for some of the things you've heard this afternoon, but I think there's something there that ought to be seriously considered. The Bible is story-oriented, community-oriented, and deeply God-centered. A second, very, very quick, huge issues here, but a second major thing to consider, and is mentioned also, stages of faith. When you talk about stages of faith, there's a major stage that I think everybody who's walking with God goes through, and it's called the dark night of the soul. And in the dark night of the soul, you begin to question everything you have ever believed. And I don't think you're on the journey with God if you never, ever have that experience. It might mean you got stuck somewhere short of where God wants you to be. I think as Seventh-day Adventists, we're afraid of doubt, because doubt often leads to more doubt. But the dark night of the soul is a call from God, using doubt to build fresh faith, and a living faith that genuinely engages the real world. In my research, when people go through the dark night of the soul, they usually take three paths. One is to flee away from it and go back into a superficial Christianity that goes through the motions. And pastors can do this. A second option is to say, well, the reason I'm having all these doubts is it's my church. My church is the problem. And then they will try other options. The unfortunate thing about that approach is that you find other churches and other religions are really not much better. In fact, usually they're equally or worse, as has been mentioned by some of our panelists this afternoon. The issues that these young people are talking about are faced in every denomination, not just Seventh-day Adventist Church. So if you're going to run from place to place looking for a better place, it may not be a search that will end well. In the dark night of the soul, it's usually helpful for somebody to go through that journey alone, with maybe one or two really solid mentors. The tragedy is we don't have many such mentors who can walk with people under those circumstances. And Ryan, I really feel for you, because you're facing this challenge with the whole world looking at you. That's not easy. That's tough. And you didn't choose it. And I appreciate you making that very clear. But what you're going through is not alone, and your emails demonstrate that. If a person is walking with God, they will walk through the valley of the shadow at some point in their lives. Are we ready to help? Or are we saying, no, you got a problem. I don't have time for that. I'm going to work with the people that are sane and normal. That's not going to get us very far, I think, as a church. I would like to mention that as I look at this panel, I think demographically, if we could just get an Asian down to the front, we would probably pretty much match the SDA Church in North America. And I'm very, very pleased about that, and I think the voices that we've heard have expressed very cogently some of the challenges that each of those groups faces. But there's another sense, just an observation, I think there were some voices here that I would have liked to hear. One of them would be the voices of my children. Every one of my children, including my son-in-law, is an active and excited member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Not one of them is anything like me. They labor with me every day, and I'm learning from them every day. And I think that's a voice that could have been helpful here. Another voice that I didn't hear is the voice of ultra-conservative youth Adventism. We may call it going back to the 19th century. But often reconnecting with the roots is necessary, as one of the panelists pointed out, is necessary if you're going to find a faith that's real for you. And so the conservative journey is another voice that may have more going for it than we may have realized. Another voice perhaps we didn't hear is the voice of the international Seventh-day Adventist Church youth. And I've been around the world. There's a lot of exciting kids out there wrestling with some of these same issues and finding some exciting paths ahead. That's not the fault of the panelists. You came because you were invited. But I'm just saying there's a few more voices that we could have heard. But I'm already going way too long. So let me just
We're
share.
sorry that we're not Asian, Dr. Carly.
Somebody's got some Asian. I'm a quarter Asian, not that I represent Asian. But I will say this, I think the experience of people of color in the church is something that needs to be dialogued, and I think that's something I'd like to take away, whether we're represented or not. I think that's the main message we were trying to say. What we've done is not enough. We need to continue to dialogue about race.
Alfredo, you complete us. Okay, I'm glad for that additional piece. All right, as you can see from the audience, there's a strong Asian interest in what's going on in the Adventist Church, and so I wanted to make sure that that was an element that we could also hear from. Just reflecting on some of the things that happened today, is there a way forward? What could the Adventist Church be thinking about as it moves forward? One would be the view of God. A word I heard particularly from Alfredo, a little bit from some of the others, is a word about fear. Growing up Adventist has a lot of fear involved in it. And I think if you really take a look at a book like Steps to Christ, there's no fear there. None whatsoever. God is the most gracious, caring person in the universe. And if our kids are afraid of God growing up Adventist, there's something wrong, because that's not. That is a God that's a little bit more like the other guy, with the pitchfork. And I think sometimes we have unwittingly turned God into the enemy. And that's one little piece I'd mention. A second, the value of freedom and critical thinking. At the core of I think, Adventist belief is the idea of freedom is very, very central to the whole universe. And that critical thinking, that's why we have the educational system we have, the only faith-based medical school in the country, the only faith-based public health school in the country. It's not an accident. It's because Seventh-day Adventists value freedom and critical thinking. And perhaps this afternoon we made a start on having this kind of open discussion, thinking through the issues, going deeply. Revelation 13 and 12 were mentioned, and rightly so, because they are at the core of what many Adventists believe and think. But perhaps in this time and place, in this generation, there are aspects of that we have underplayed. Because what does Revelation 13 really say? If you look at it from the first century perspective, looking down over 2,000 years, you know what it says? It's Christianity that will break the planet. It is Christendom that is undermining the picture of God and the mission that Jesus had in the world. In other words, the church and the kingdom are not the same, and sometimes the church gets in the way of the kingdom. You see? So I think perhaps the Revelation 13 story is maybe more relevant than it ever was. But perhaps we need to frame it in a new context with new questions and new challenges. I would suggest we might want to read the Bible more than ever before, rather than simply sift through proof texts. Because the Bible has the capacity to address every question in every generation. But if we're not looking, if we feel like we already have it, then we won't be there. I would also remind us that if you look at the story of Jesus, Jesus was on the side of the outsiders. Some of the things that were said today might have made a number of us uncomfortable. But that's one reason why Jesus was disliked. Because he was with the people that made the religious leaders uncomfortable. He was affirming people that were on the outside. And Jesus said, if you want to follow me, you got to be where I am. Where is Jesus? He's with the outcasts. He's with the outsiders. He's washing feet. And perhaps most important, and reflecting on several of the things that were said today, I think it's high time we recognize that there's more than one right way to think. If there's only one right way to